I would like to share with you the results of my research that I have been conducted in Maya region located in southeastern Mexico, in the Yucatan Peninsula. In the history of Mexico, educational policies have tended to be more of assimilation. Because of that, right now we have an educational gap among indigenous people and non-indigenous people. In order to identify what works in girls' education in this specific region, it is necessary first to identify the main challenges these girls have. The challenges they have is the poverty, high rates of poverty, also the isolation of the villages, cultural barriers, and gender norms. The support that I already have are international agreements, the majority of them in the framework of the United Nations, also governmental programs, scholarships, and also indigenous approaches. The main recommendation that I have that are related to my research activities is that it is really necessary to include in the curricula the indigenous knowledge so the children, especially the girls, can relate with it. Also, it is necessary to have teachers who are really engaged with those communities. Another important aspect of this research is to expand online education. The majority of these girls doesn't have any money or resources to go to the cities to achieve higher levels of schooling. Because of that, we need to bring the school to them. Also, it is necessary to establish better mechanisms to try to report any kind of abuse. It was really hard for me to hear the histories of children, especially girls, who face a lot of mistreatment from rural teachers, people who is not engaged with these communities. And when the moms try to talk about it in the school, people don't listen to them because they do not speak Spanish, they speak Maya. Also, it is necessary to enhance positive female role models. These girls imitate what is close to them. I would like to share with you a story about a former student that I have that right now, she's indigenous, she's a student in Mexico City, her master's degree. And I was talking with her about how come that she has been right now a student in very harsh conditions. And she explained to me, you know something, it is very important to me to achieve my master's degree because I know my little sisters are looking after me. So I have to do this, not only for me, but also for my little sisters. Because of that, I understand now how important it is to have these positive female role models. And last, it is very important to enhance and to recognize that these girls need extra emotional support from their moms. If their moms are not available to do that, an aunt, a godmother, a grandmother should be involved with those girls. They face major challenges for being indigenous. Lastly, I would like to say that it's very important to understand that if a girl is educated, she's going to be more respected. Thank you.
So here in Falk, moderating the panel with Mira Christina on the topic of addressing girls facing the quadruple burden will be Lyric Thompson, who is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Center for Research on Women. She was instrumental in developing the U.S. global strategy to empower adolescent girls, the first ever government strategy here that includes implementation plans from USAID, the Department of State, Peace Corps, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Joining their panel will be Smriti Sharma, who is a research fellow at UNU Wider. She has conducted research on caste and gender-based discrimination in India and Bangladesh, specifically analyzing women's role in household decision-making, caste-based crimes, and employment gaps and gender wage gaps. And then finally, Sofia Zahova is a researcher at Vigdis Finnbogadóttir Institute of Foreign Languages at the University of Iceland. And she has been involved in a number of Romani community-oriented projects and initiatives that have focused on access to education and culture, reading and writing skills, and Romani book publishing. She's authored the UNICEF commissioned report on research on the social norms which prevent Roma girls from access to education, focusing specifically in Bulgaria.
I'm Lyric Thompson with the International Center for Research on Women, as was discussed earlier. And I also do some work in various advocacy coalitions on girls, the Coalition for Adolescent Girls, Girls Not Brides USA, and the FGM Network. So it's been such a pleasure for me to hear the presentations and speakers this morning, because it's always useful to have new data points, new stories to tell policymakers about the who and the why, and most importantly, the how of how do we help girls overcome barriers by meeting them where they are. And we're learning a lot today in this session on the quadruple burden of how complicated that gets. So at ICRW, we have done quite a bit of research and advocacy talking about the sort of dual burden that girls face between gender as females and between age. So how they are disempowered in various communities and networks to advocate for themselves, to learn, to reach opportunities because of those two factors. Well, today we're going to go a lot deeper than that. You shared with us, Maria Cristina, thank you, a very helpful, I wish we could put it back up behind us, overlapping Venn diagram of your quadruple burden of the challenges not only of gender, but also of girls who are from indigenous communities. In your research, the Maya girls, the rural-urban issue, the challenges that we face going that last mile, meeting rural girls where they are. And then also poverty, of course, which is, I think ever present in many of our discussions. So we're going to dig deeper. We're using your presentation, Maria Cristina, as sort of the starting point. We're going to hear a little bit from Smithy and Sophia about their research. And then we'll come back to you and dig a little bit deeper, because there was so much that I wanted to ask you, and happily, I have that opportunity. So let's get going. Maria Cristina, there was something very powerful that I think got glossed over for time at the end of your presentation, where you were mentioning some of the barriers that the Maya girls face, and you specifically called out abuse, teacher abuse, because girls are seen as less than human in the Maya community. They're not one of us, so it doesn't matter what happens to them. There's some sort of impunity that we have. And it's interesting because, Smithy, your research is focused on the Dalit communities in India, which of course are the untouchables, the lowest caste. And ICRW does a lot of work in India. We have an office in Delhi. We have a number of researchers there who do work throughout South Asia, but specifically in India. And one of my colleagues was in town, I guess, pretty quickly following the 2012 terrible and publicly outcry around the rape of the 23-year-old woman on the bus in Delhi. And he said something that I hadn't heard in any of the news that was covering that rape and the subsequent judicial process that happened. He said the same thing happened to a Dalit girl a couple weeks beforehand, and nobody said anything. And he attributes the outcry, which was very, very, very useful in moving forward a number of legal and judicial reforms, not all of them, unfortunately, but a number of the reforms that came out of that episode were a result of the national and international outcry about this. And he says she was an upper caste girl, she was educated, and that's why there was the outcry. So that I found, I've been working on these issues for 10 years, I found that to be a moment to stop and reflect about what are we missing when we're not getting into issues of caste, of ethnicity, et cetera. Tell us a little bit about your research on the Dalit girls in particular, and help us understand not only barriers, but hopefully solutions.
So in some of the research that I've done, I looked at more caste-based violence in general, and the broad takeaway of that is that a lot of these crimes that are committed by the upper castes or the forward castes against the Dalits, and also there's another marginalized group called the Adivasis, who are the tribal groups, but traditionally they're not a part of the caste system, so we can take that later in the Q&A, but I'm going to talk more about Dalits at this point. And a lot of the crimes by the upper castes against the lower castes are basically in response to sort of perceived transgressions. And I'm measuring that when there is a sort of reduction or a convergence in the economic status between the groups. So you basically have the upper castes committing crimes against the lower castes as a way to sort of put them back in their place. And that is something that we see getting reflected also in crimes against Dalit women. And there's a lot of work that's come out of NGOs, but also just social observers, who say that crimes against Dalit women are basically as a way to punish the entire community. And so it's very different from crimes against non-Dalit women, and that's basically because traditionally women tend to wear the badge of honor for the family, and violating the rights of a woman is a way to sort of attack the family or the community honor. One of the other things that makes this phenomenon particularly striking is that a lot of the crimes against Dalit women are public crimes. So they'll be gang raped, attacked in the fields, in public toilets, in public spaces. And then there are specific crimes, like they'll be paraded naked through the villages. And these are not crimes that you see against non-Dalit women. So most crimes against non-Dalit women tend to be in private spaces, which, while bad in itself, is not as bad as a public crime, which further adds to the humiliation and the vulnerability that these groups face. And then there are other sorts of institutionalized things, which, like religious prostitution, called the Devdasi system, where a Dalit woman, even though she's untouchable, she basically is recognized as sort of a local goddess. And then it's okay for upper caste men to have sexual relations with her, but then she's pretty much branded a prostitute by the entire community. And although untouchability and the Devdasi system have been outlawed in India, it is still practiced in varying forms. I was reading a recent report that there are still almost probably 25,000 Devdasis in India, and this is predominantly in the southern states. But there are all these barriers that women face, and the violence that they face spills over into various domains. I think we can come back to that later, but it makes it extremely risky for these girls to go to school, to participate in broader society. And even though there are laws that prohibit these sorts of crimes, like there are special laws prohibiting crimes against these marginalized groups, they barely have any bite. I mean, there's supposed to be special courts that handle cases that are filed under these Prevention of Atrocities Act and the Protection of Civil Rights Act, but conviction numbers are really low. A lot of times the local police is sort of hand in glove with the local community leaders, who tend to be mostly upper castes. And so these cases never, sort of come to the news, and what gets reported to the police is only like the tip of the iceberg.
So it's institutionalized. It's in the justice system. It's in the education system.
Yes.
These girls are set up to fail from the very beginning, essentially. All right, we'll come back to dig in a bit deeper on that. But Sophia, I wanted to ask you, I read one of your articles about some of the work that you've been doing on the Roma community, which of course is Europe's largest ethnic minority. And you've been focused on a topic that's very close to my own heart recently through your work with UNICEF on child marriage. I thought it was interesting because in addition to sort of exploring the who and the why behind the numbers and trends, and I'll let you tell us about what those are, you also mentioned some frustration about the media just honing in on this narrative of Roma girls all being child brides and kind of reinforcing the stigma and the prejudice that we have around this. I thought it was interesting because just as you all are very educated and with it, so this may not work as an experiment here, but who all is generally familiar with the Roma community? Show of hands. Okay, pretty much everybody. Not representative of Americans, I don't think. Who has seen My Big Fat American Gypsy Wedding? Who has it? Yeah. Okay. So I think we have an inverse population in this room. I would wager to say that in the broader America outside of Brookings, you may not have folks who know who the Roma are or any of these patterns of exclusion that they're facing, but they may have tuned in to My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, which I think reinforces a lot of the stereotypes that you're about to tell us about. So tell us a little bit about your research, what's going on with the Roma girls, and importantly, what's the good news? Where do we go from here?
Yeah, okay, I'm aware that some of you know about Roma. However, it's always good to start with some basic things who we researchers know, and that is that when we say Roma, these are not people from the storybooks or from literature characters, but we are talking about a community that is often referred as intergroup, ethnic community. That means that it comprises of different groups that have their own Romani language or another language, who have different religious backgrounds, have different nationalities. However, they have awareness that they belong to a big Roma community. And which is the most important for the Roma are to which group do they belong. And the belonging to a group is a main determinator of the level of education and marriage pattern that are usually interrelated. As for most communities, for Roma, this correlation between the marriage pattern and educational level are interrelated. And the good news here is that the majority of Roma girls have their right to education guaranteed, so they graduate compulsory education, they even go to high schools, they are university graduates, a lot in Eastern Europe, and a few years ago we had the first PhD candidate of Roma ethnicity, a colleague of ours, ethnologist, of a Romani background, a female. Therefore, the majority trend, the trend among the Romani majority in Eastern Europe is that they have their rights guarantees in terms of education. However, among some groups and some communities, we still have this problem existing in our developed East and Western European states, so members of European Union and so on. And the question that I was asked was why and what are the factors? And I'm thankful to Jean Sperling to talking about successes in contrast to issues. And that was very important for the research that I've done. So I was showing national trends. I was going to communities in which girls go to higher school, to university, and I also went to neighboring communities that might be even in the same city that were practicing early marriages, and the girls dropped out even before graduating primary school. To compare these trends and to see where the troubles are. And when we turn back to the issue of poverty, of course, the general national trend showed that for only a decade, from 2001 to 2011, we have like a decrease of the number of girls who drop out of school with more than 30%. We have increase of the educational level. We have more than 30% a decrease of the in the girls who are concluding early marriages before the age of 18, and even the percentage is bigger before the age of 16. So therefore, many Roma themselves and many Roma group express the opinion that in 10 years or in 15 years there would be no early marriages. However, we discovered that in groups that are not practicing early marriage, girls dropped out of school. And then the question was why? So one of the reasons for dropping out of school and for early marriage that is pointed out by both researchers and Roma themselves is that there is a virginity requirement. So the Roma girl has to enter marriage as a virgin, and this is important for the family, for the honor of the family, and for the whole community. And therefore this was and it pointed out as a reason. However, in the groups that don't practice early marriages, the virginity requirement was kept. So this practically could work. But the question was, were there any first walkers? Were there any role models? Were there any pioneers among the girls who graduated higher education? So first thing is, if this is a practice at all that is known to this group or community. Question number one. And if there was someone who started 10 years ago or 15 years ago, then it was more easier for the model to become common for the group and to become a mainstream. And then we will come back to the issue of poverty. It appeared that groups and girls among which the early marriage is not practiced, the girls stopped going to school because of economic reasons. So their parents could not provide for them to go from the village where there is only primary school to continue their education in a higher school in the nearby town because of economic reasons on the first place. But sometimes it was a combination between economic reasons or prevailing of the concerns that the girls going there would be out of the community. So, and for the mainstream society, for the majority society, it's common that teenagers have sex. So this would threaten their virginity and so on. So the parents' concerns about where their daughters are going every day. So we have this in a way interrelated reasons. But also an interesting thing was that the communities and groups living in villages were more open to change because they were anyway living among majority society and communicating, open to change when compared, for example, to neighborhoods that were densely populated with Roma, where they had like segregated part with very poor people. So among them, the pattern of early marriage and getting a high level of education was changing very slowly because of the isolation, so to say. Yeah, and finally, of course, we have the economic transition. So after the crash of the socialist Europe, so to say, we have the economic transition, and then we have a higher level of unemployment that among the Roma are even higher than the majority. So the Roma themselves were also not seeing this as education for their daughters and sons alike, seeing this as a social capital who would help them, that would help them to find a job afterwards. And so it was also the majority, like the social context of high rates of unemployment and of course of discrimination on an ethnic basis when you apply for jobs. So even though if you are educated, you go to an interview and of course you're not preferred because of your Roma background.
Interesting. You've all kind of hinted at this, and Jasmine also did in her presentation of that the measure of equity isn't a useful measure in this case. It's a useful measure in terms of, are we on track to correcting levels? Are we progressing toward equal access for girls and boys? But that there's so much more to say about who's in those seats and what's going on, and this is what you're teasing out here. I'm interested in, how do you correct for that? What are some of the solutions here? You mentioned, Maria Cristina, I think 3 levels in your presentation of how we can attack each of these issues and make sure that it's not just equal numbers of boys and girls, butts and seats, which we've achieved in Mexico, close, and in Jamaica, but how are we making sure that it's equal within all these other pockets of inequality? So you mentioned, I think, at the international level, at the sort of government level, and at the indigenous level. Correct me if I've got my levels wrong. I have them in my notes, but I'm not looking at them. Tell us a little bit more about some of those, because I think that's what the folks in this room are going to want to take home and say, this is a recommendation we can rally behind.
What is really working is indigenous approaches. And the reason is because they talk and they understand, because they face the same challenges. For example, one of the purposes of this is the Canadian government to the University of Lethbridge and Lakehead University. They receive large groups of indigenous girls so they can learn how to talk in English. So that is an important asset because they are open the world to them. So if they can communicate, they are going to have more possibilities to have scholarships.
Sure.
Also, the Mexican government is really supporting indigenous people, giving a lot of scholarships. The situation we have with that is that some of the population express that they don't know how to apply for these supports. So we have the support, but maybe we need to improve the channels of communication.
Okay. So to follow up, how do we do that? What is a tool? What are we, both actually in your article, I think that's on the Brookings platform, and what you just mentioned, you both mentioned role models, the importance of that. We see that in the United States as well, the importance of getting girls into STEM careers. They got to see a female engineer, et cetera. Like, are there programs that are facilitating these sorts of things? How do we kind of like accelerate what we know works? And that's open for everybody. We'll start with you if you want to expand.
Yeah, one of the things that I said about the scholarships is that if we know we have this problem, that we have all these funds available, so we need to try to implement campaigns so people can apply for these supports, because they could represent the difference between a girl who can be educated or not educated. Mm-hmm. So one is the suggestion that I have in the policy brief.
Excellent. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Well, actually, with just a historical, again, a historical perspective from the socialist Europe, so to say, from Bulgaria particularly, when in the early 50s, when the government was reinforcing gender equality for all the women and the men in the women in the country, Roma women were included in the programs like for training emancipated women, how to get educated and how to get integrated into the labor market. And this is very positively assessed by the Romani communities, because the women, they first went to a training, they first went to a group of talking to other Roma and non-Roma women, so they get self-esteem, so afterwards they were provided the jobs and so on. So, but it was again not particularly targeted to Roma. Roma were just included as part of the gender support policies for equality of genders in the country. Now there are programs that are supporting Roma students to prepare their application, for example, for the university. So they are targeted to Roma, not particularly to girls, but because in the recent years this issue of the girls staying behind is brought. I think now is on a governmental level, but also in some programs, and NGOs are thinking about supporting girls. But of course, not only scholarship, any kind of measures that are very localized make sense, because things are very individual. Sometimes it's a girl that got dropped out of school because of an early marriage, but 1 year later, she's maybe divorced. So what you do, the programs for scholarship at the university are not working. You have to support her in a different way to integrate her. So the issue is brought more or less from the bottom, so to say. Well, on the level of government, I think it's important, or institution, is just, the thing is that all that is on paper has to work. So we have the rules, that's clear, but it's often the institutions turn a blind eye on what is happening, thinking stereotypically that this is like a Roma tradition. Okay, girls drop out. We don't care. We have they have to go to school until the age of 16, yeah, and their parents have to be like punished for not sending their girls to school. But yeah, it's Roma, so it's a question of ensuring that everything works equally for all.
Absolutely. What I don't want us to take from this discussion is that it's not gender that matters. It's only I don't think we should be playing disability Olympics here in terms of which thrust we're gonna take all of our money out of gender programming and we're gonna put it all into understanding ethnic minorities and caste and those sorts of things. So if you could each give me a sense, maybe starting with you, Smithy, of the importance of gender here. What is the kind of the ideal scenario where we are pulling apart some of these underpinning power dynamics, we're still concentrating on patriarchy, but we're doing that with a lens that says, okay, here's how these different factors interplay. Tell us a little bit more about the importance of gender specifically within these communities.
So I think here, so I'm going to talk first in the context of gender, so which sort of spans across all caste groups. So it's a stylized fact that women or girls are less likely to go to school, parents are less likely to spend on their education, devote less attention to them, and a lot of this is explained by a preference for sons. And that's basically because sons are meant to be providers for their parents. In their old age, they would typically continue staying with the parents even after they get married. And this sort of deters investment into girls because investing in a girl is like watering somebody else's garden, so to say. Because she's going to get married and go into somebody else's house and you have to pay a dowry for her. So having a girl is maybe perceived to be a financial burden, which then deters investment from an early age. Now, obviously, these kinds of problems, there is some sort of anecdotal evidence that in Dalit communities, there may be more egalitarian gender relations, but this relationship has been changing over time. So M.N. Srinivas, who's a very well-known caste scholar, coined this word called Sanskritization, which basically means that as all caste groups are improving economically, the lower castes want to emulate the upper castes in order to sort of become upwardly mobile and to fit in. And this basically means that they're going to adopt a lot of the practices which are pretty harmful to women. So earlier dowry was not such a big deal among the low caste communities, also because they are much poorer. So it wasn't really a trend or a pattern in the Dalit communities, but that is something that's catching up. Domestic violence is also as bad. In fact, there are reports that maybe it's worse. So I don't want to say that that for every particular aspect, the situation is worse in the Dalit community than in the non-Dalit community, but we have to be mindful here that the Dalit women are much poorer, right? So, and a lot of them in rural areas particularly have lower voice, so they don't know how to address their concerns. And so basically, in the realm of education, there was a recent UNICEF report in 2014 which showed that exclusion from primary education levels is actually the greatest for Dalit girls as compared to any other gender caste grouping. And a lot of that is explained by either they are not enrolling or then they end up enrolling much later because their brothers get preference in being sent to school, and then basically they're too old for their class, and that leads to them sort of lagging behind and dropping out. And then once you drop out, you're pretty much not going to join back because then you're a teenager, so then you're helping out your mom, you're taking care of your siblings. And so I think maybe when we come back to solutions, we can talk about how there's a need to not only bridge these sorts of gaps at the higher education level, which is what the current affirmative action policy in India does, but I think we need to look a lot more at the primary education level to be able to stem sort of dropout and exclusion at that stage of the education process.
So that's interesting. You've just kind of added a fifth layer of our sort of burden here, which is age within girls, and that particular intervention that's done, some say a good job, some have some criticisms of targeting educational opportunities for the Dalit girls is coming in too late. It's happening at the tertiary level, but we've already missed. Those girls have already married. Their lives are already kind of
taken a different trajectory. Yes. So for those of you who may not be aware, I can take a minute to just tell you what the affirmative action policy in India is. So India became independent in 1947, and then in 1950 we came up with a constitution, and the person who drafted the constitution was B.R. Ambedkar, who himself was a Dalit individual. And one of the things that was decided at that point in order to bring the Dalit groups up to parity was that there would be mandated representation in the realm of political representation, in higher education, and in government jobs. And so political representation has been fairly successful in improving the outcomes of the lower caste groups in terms of sort of getting them to be able to allocate resources to the needs of their community. But of course, somewhere within that, the gender angle is sort of lost, because a lot of those seats that are reserved for the scheduled castes or the Dalits are usually taken up by men. So I think by some recent estimates, in the current lower house in the parliament, I think only 10% of the Dalit seats are held by Dalit women.
Interesting.
Which means that their needs are not really getting represented. In the domain of education, the benefits only kick in at the higher education level. So you pretty much have to work your way through all of your school life in order to actually reach up to the age of 18 when you can compete for a seat to college, in which case like 16% of seats are reserved for these individuals. But then we have like this whole long tail of people who never actually even made it to that level. And here there have been a couple of government policies, but we know very little about how they're actually doing in terms of large-scale meaningful evaluation. So in 2004, there was a large government program called the Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya, which was a system of upper primary residential schools. And I think currently there are about 3,700 of those across the country, and they were meant to be set up in educationally backward areas, so where female literacy is quite low, and also the gender gap in literacy is particularly low, and 75% of the spots in these schools are reserved for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other minority girls, and the rest 25% are for other below poverty line families. And there's been a recent study, but it's a working paper, and they basically find that there was some improvement in female literacy rates on account of this program. But this also only kicks in at the upper primary level, so we're talking like grade 7, and you really need to be able to push through until that age. And so here there's a lot of non-state actors who are coming in. So recently there was this Netflix documentary called Daughters of Destiny, and it was talking about this privately funded school, a residential school, which takes in 24 students in every cohort, like right from the preschool age, and they support them through their entire schooling. So it's a free education, and then they support most of the costs through college. And it seems like it's a model that's working, but it's pretty small. But I think that they're trying to scale up. I came across some other initiatives, but I think that there's much more that can be done.
Absolutely. And I think it's important that you're pulling out the importance of policy evaluation or program evaluation in the case of the subsequent example that you gave, which we also heard in Jasmine's presentation of like, we think this is going well, but nobody's really actually looked under the hood in a robust way. So I think that's something that this community, who's a community who knows a lot about asking good questions and measuring things, can take back, is making sure that we're interrogating these approaches and then scaling them where they work and course correcting where they don't. I wanted to give Sophia and Maria Cristina an opportunity to come back to the first question that's set out in that round, which was something you'd like the audience to know about the importance of gender specifically within these communities. I'd love that to be solutions oriented. We've just heard a little bit about where we've lost ground on gender, where we've tried to target only looking at in the Indian case, the caste system. Any corollaries that you'd like to share or help us think about the importance of gender in your own work?
May I?
Yeah, sure, please.
I think that indigenous education is advancing in Mexico. However, the gender approach needs to be included. So I think this is the important issue with us in Mexico.
Well, with the gender, I think another stereotype, so to say, is that the Romani women are completely powerless or indecisive or under the head of the patriarch, which is not actually true. But the woman in the family gets her power with age, so to say. So I would say the elders, men and women equally in the Roma community, are like completely equals when taking decisions. And it's the woman who keeps the traditions, the values, raises the children, how do they have to behave, what to do. But because of this, women became the changers, so to say, those who brought changes. And that's why it's very important to know that Roma women are those who communicate with schools, go to parents' meetings, go to institutions like municipalities, and so this is very important. And a curious fact is actually that, but this is also something that is valid for the majority societies in our country, is that the Roma girls get enrolled to school than Roma boys, for example. So the university graduates females, Roma females, are bigger than the males. On the other hand, of course, when we have the problem with the early marriage, it's a problem only for the girl. So then in these communities, their husbands even may go to school, to high school and so on, but they have to stay at home. So we have different examples, but we have to look at the Romani women as a change bringer. Yeah.
Absolutely, the importance of that.
And also when in the community there is examples of successful women as teachers, workers in municipality, lawyers and doctors, that of course also brings a lot of change.
Absolutely. Hold girls and women up as the change makers that they are. Okay, so we're going to transition now to the audience Q&A because we'd love to hear from you. Please introduce yourself, let us know who you are, and briefly, and then please come to a question with haste so that we can get as many questions in before we all go off to our networking lunch. We've got someone in the front row here. Please, welcome.
Hello, my name is Chris Murray. I'm a high school history teacher. Thank you, Adam. Hello, my name is Chris Murray. I'm a curriculum. Do kids in Mexico, India, Europe, do they get the chance to learn who the Maya, the Dalit, and the Roma are? Is that part of the curriculum for
Yeah. Things are improving in Mexico. Since last year, we have this new educational model that is trying to implement indigenous knowledge in the curricula. So yes, we're addressing that issue.
To the best of my knowledge, that is not true for Indian school curriculum. So for instance, I did not know about the construct of caste until I came to college.
And in the case of Europe, the short question is yes. It depends in which countries, but it's more and more included in the curricular for the Roma students. They can have faculty classes on Romani culture and even language. And in some countries, as Romania, they can have their full course of education until high school in Romani language, so their textbooks and so on. And even their efforts for including the Roma-related history programs in the mainstream programs for schools.
Wonderful. Another question? Yes, up in front.
Hi, Jill Gay, What Works Association. Would you talk in the three different contexts, starting in early education, what are the gender norms that are provided within the education system? So for example, in Senegal, some of the textbooks only show the mother serving the son, and are very gender stereotypical. And so I wanted to know what the context was for each of you.
Are you talking about in the household or in the educational system?
In the educational system.
Well, maybe in the past, but right now it's more advanced, so it's not in the textbook. However, in the household, it is expected that the girls, they need to do everything for the boys. So, yeah, it is changing in the cities, but if you travel a little bit far away from Merida City, from Cancun City, then you're going to find these stereotypes where girls are doing almost everything. So, yes, we're trying to implement some actions to try to change things inside the households as well. Thank you.
I think it's pretty much the same in India. I don't think you would see educational materials sort of reinforcing gender stereotypes, at least deliberately. But yes, again, within the household and in broader society, there are these very gendered expectations about how girls should behave and how their needs probably should come after that of the boys and the men in their family. Yeah,
and pretty similar in the Romani context. So the mainstream education that Roma girls attend, it's just general education, not reinforcing such gender roles. And the same, it's a different context in the community, but it's not only for the Roma, but for, so to say, the Balkan communities also. So all other ethnicities in the Balkans, what the gender roles are, at least traditionally, it's the notion is within the family, and of course you get it through everyday discourse, actions, and so on.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. At ICRW, we have a curriculum that we've done in thousands of schools. Started with 2,500 schools in Maharashtra and has been scaled throughout several states in India and other countries in the region. And it's, to your point, Smitty, it is very focused on gender transformative images, exactly what you're saying of, who's cooking the meals at home versus who's getting paid to cook meals at the restaurant. And is the girl, when she comes home from school, able to play and do homework, or is she doing chores? And what about my brother? And those sorts of things. Being a research institute, we have the study to demonstrate how that course of attitude and behavior change happens once girls and boys at a young age are starting to sort of interrogate some of these roles and attitudes. But to your point, I don't think there's anything on caste in that. And it's very interesting to me that you didn't hear about caste in India until you got to college. And I think that that's something that I can take home today, is what are we doing in our work there? Because I think there's even the private sector has been engaged in some of this. How do we get images of girls in commercials playing sports, being powerful? Actually, Always Feminine Hygiene brand has done some really great stuff in that area. It's like we're all consuming these messages everywhere. It's not just textbooks. It's also every media overstimulated environment that we live in. Yes, down in front, we've got 2 questions. If we could take both these questions and maybe one more, there was a third behind, and then we'll give it to the panelists to answer in a group.
Hi, I'm Samira Daniels. I'm interested in education generally. I'm fascinated that you, if I could just extend this question about why is it that you learned about the caste system in college when the discussion in the political sphere, at least, from what I understand, there is this emphasis on getting lower castes into, so I'm just curious. I mean, what did you not know? Maybe that's what I would.
And can we go two more questions here, and then we'll come to the panelists.
Hi, I'm Katherine Begley. I work at CARE. I'm interested in learning a little bit more about your experience in promoting girls' leadership competencies and its relationship to improvements in learning and retention in school or other learning opportunities.
And then the red jacket here.
Hi, I'm Neovia Pantykey from the World Bank. I just had a question for Smriti regarding affirmative action. I think, and I may be wrong, unless you have statistics to prove otherwise, I want to see what improvement we've made in India by this affirmative action, because as far as I see it, it's highly politicized. It keeps expanding. Every political party counts it as a hot potato, cannot pull it back, and it's almost coming to the point of reverse discrimination.
So 2 questions for you, Smitty. We'll let you start with those, and then anyone who would like to reflect on our question about school-based learning and also non-school-based opportunities.
So I'll answer your question first. So, well, I think when I was growing up, it's not that I did not know what caste was. So you knew that your domestic help was different from your social group, but we weren't so aware of, at least as children, we're not so aware of the sort of hierarchical ordering and how rigid that is in terms of you have to marry within your own caste. The domestic help eat from different utensils. They have to, like, the people who come to sweep your house are different from the ones who cook. And so those sorts of things those were just observations, but, I didn't sort of know the theory or the mechanisms behind what sustains this. And then once we came to college, there was some discussion about, like, okay, this is the caste system, this is what it means. But to actually know about the history of the caste system, that's not something that we were exposed to in school. And in fact, I think that a lot of historians have been arguing with the education boards that this is something that we need to talk about at the school level. But I think this is a very politicized topic where the Indian government does not want to talk about minority groups, and at the school level at least. And to come to your question, there are a lot of, I'm an economist by training, and there are a lot of rigorous evaluations of this policy. And so if we were to think of a counterfactual world where these reservations or this affirmative action policy was not there, a lot of the children a lot of the students who do make it to college would not have been there in the absence of these programs. Of course, at the individual level, you can say that every low-caste student who gets in displaces a high caste and maybe more a higher scoring student. But I think we have to look at it more as a societal good. And what that means in terms of upliftment of the whole community. Even in terms of political reservations, there's a lot more evidence that villages tend to be highly segregated, and the low caste live in different pockets within the village. But their access to water wells and to roads, etc., has improved because politicians from their groups have been able to divert resources towards the needs of their communities. And of course, currently, the reservation scheme is highly politicized because we now have another new group called the other backward classes who don't suffer the stigma of untouchability, but then they are economically and socially backward. And so there are reservations for them. And now that's taken it up to 50% of seats in colleges are reserved for individuals from one or the other of these groups. So that has now become a very politicized debate, and I think we've seen some of that even in the context of US universities.
Oh, absolutely.
For instance.
My other panelists, would you care to respond to?
Well, I think actually, to my knowledge at least, I'm not aware of any programs for leadership skill development and so on. However, there is something that is for both girls and boys that is considered very successful. These are programs that are extracurricular programs, developing project, group working, initiatives development, and group organizing and group management within the school or within the class, or even working with younger generations of the same school. So these are kind of that simultaneously lead to development of leadership skills without being the objective of these initiatives and projects and activities in schools.
Yeah, one of the programs in Mexico, the name is Kunafa. So it's very successful for this reason. Is these Maya girls who want to attend university degrees, who want to go to university, they engage with this program for 1 year or 2 years, and they go to various isolated communities, and they teach the girls in Maya, primary level. At the end of this program, because of their participation in the Kunafa program, they are available to have all the university is already paid because of this program. So it's a very successful program that I would like to recognize in this forum.
That's fabulous. Okay, we're going to do another round. I'm coming back to the woman in the fabulous lipstick since we missed her last time. And then can you give me a show of hands again? I know there were more in the back and on this side. Okay, on the front. Hi. Okay, we're going to go 1 and then 2, 3, and then I'll come back.
Hi, Sartaj Kaur from the Global Partnership for Education. Just a quick question. I wanted to piggyback on the gender norms question and think about how this institutional form of oppression we know sort of takes away from dignity and agency of young girls, and how those are very important aspects in realizing any sort of legal rights as well. So my question is, what, in your experience, what have been effective interventions? So is it interventions that target other issues that we assume will change gender norms? Or is it interventions that specifically target gender norms? I'm just sort of thinking of examples that you may have come across in your work.
Yeah. Okay, we've got 2. Oh, already lined up perfectly.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Laura Henderson, independent consultant. And I was interested in asking whether any of you could comment on your home context, whether there are opportunities for girls to learn advocacy so that they can really kind of have their voices be heard on the variety of issues that you've covered today. Be very interested in opportunities for that in your countries.
Thank you for that great question. I promise it wasn't a plant. And number 3.
for Mayan girls in remote locations. I just wanted you to comment a little bit more about that and its promise, because I certainly agree it has a lot of promise and there's data to support that, as you note, but it also seems like it needs some kind of almost its own infrastructure along with it, which is to say that in these communities where technology is already not known well and problematic, I've seen in rural Honduras where it's really tough when, I mean, I'm the parent of a middle schooler, you can't stick a bunch of 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds in a room by themselves and have it go well. And so what does the government really need to do to make this work better? And I just wanted to hear your comments on that and really the reality check, I guess, on whether the government will come through and even do that for these communities. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you.
Kathy. I'm going to do one final question because I'm looking at the clock and we're not going to have time for another round. This woman, exactly, perfect. It's Mike.
Good morning. I'm Shar Haruna. I'm from the Hamza Girls Education Center in Tawa, Niger. And I'd kind of like to lift the hood a little bit on some of the funding disparities on gender. For example, I always hear the statistics on women in Niger. However, there's a great disparity of funding programs for a lot of countries like Niger. And we use the statistics to scaffold the issue, but never really discuss the disparity in funding of gender issues. So I'd like to kind of discuss that a little bit and hear your input on, where your different organizations, or, global organizations will actually start discussing that as a challenge. Thank you.
Excellent final question. Okay, panel, respond it well. We'll start with Sophia and come down the line.
Okay. Well, I somehow try to connect the questions about how we introduce gender and with which approaches and the legislation thing. Because I think, at least for the Roma communities, the most, so to say, natural and logical development goes like this. It's first, some girls go to school, and depending on the level of education, they are the first who get this education. Is it primary, is it secondary, or is it university? And then become, so there are not much of an intervention needed. And actually, I don't think they're quite workable, maybe supportive measures, but from the top, it's certainly not very much workable. So for example, if we talk about implementation of law, when an early marriage occurs, that's of course illegal, especially when it's below the age of 14, and it's also below the age of 16. So the persecutors has to take measures. And some of these girls, for example, are put in shelter organizations to protect them. But the girls are themselves very unhappy with being there, putting in an institution instead of being happily married according to their perception. To the one that they would like to marry. Therefore, I don't think that any intervention and any cliches or slogans about gender equality would work, but just being on the ground and supporting things that anyway happening naturally, or if not happening, maybe stimulate through supporting of the levels that are higher of education for the girls. So that would be my opinion, because many Roma and also many social workers express will to have more sanctions and more sanctions, but actually sanctions doesn't work because they've been there for 70 years. So therefore, I think everything has to be really very individualized and related to the community. Yeah, and of course, it's not that much related to gender, but seeing as education as a social capital for your daughter or your son or your children in general.
So to come to the first question, some of the the political representation for women at local governance levels, this was through an act in India in 1993. A lot of studies have found pretty meaningful impacts of exposure to female role models in terms of improving aspirations for daughters' education, for wanting daughters to work, delaying the age of marriage. Having said that, I don't think that there have been any sort of meaningful evaluations or even just sort of anecdotal studies looking at how this works, particularly in the context of Dalit women, because the way that this reservation works is that 1/3 of the female leaders are supposed to be from the Dalit communities, but I don't think we know much about how it actually translates into better outcomes, or if it does, for Dalit women. On the point of advocacy, I think for the longest time, so there have been these feminist, India has had a long tradition of feminist movements and also Dalit empowerment movements, but I think Dalit women were feeling that there's a need to fill this vacuum where their own needs were not being met, because either they were sort of getting covered under this umbrella of women or Dalit, but then their specific needs, like I highlighted earlier, particularly the kinds of violence that they face, it's very specific to that particular subgroup. And so in the last probably 10 to 15 years, there have been Dalit women's movements. And I think now they're starting to find some traction in India, but they've been increasingly doing international outreach and coming to, and I think like working, for example, with Black Lives Matter and with other similar movements in different countries in order to be able to mobilize and get recognition from politicians back at home.
Wonderful.
Yeah, about online education, I would like to say that we are working with very isolated communities with high rates of poverty. So having online education is the only option they could have because they don't have any money for transportation or for accommodation. So it is the future, and the Mexican government is investing on it. They recognize it is important to do that. And also I would like to highlight the importance of the mothers in this process. During the interviews, when I was talking with them, they said to me, you know, life is too hard for a woman in Mexico. You have to work several hours, and you only earn a little bit. I don't want that for my daughter. I want something better for her. So I really would like to emphasize that if you support a girl in an emotional way, if you talk to her, if you ask her, how was your day, she's going to be successful. So I would like to end with that note.
Okay, excellent. I want to come back and ask just if anybody wants to pick up the question on technology and like, is it a panacea? Are we able to, is this like our cheapest way to reach particularly excluded girls, or is there, more infrastructure that needs to be built? Just any thoughts that you have you seen the technology piece at play? Anyone?
Yeah, we're advancing in the rural zones. Talking with the parents, they said, we have new schools. It's like they recognize that new investment is made in their villages, so it's happening with us.
Okay, great. So we're hearing definitely we need to intervene at the community level. We need to look super micro at what are the challenges, what are the barriers, and how are we addressing them for different kinds of girls in different places. As an advocate, I have to insist that I think you also have to intervene at the policy level, and that girls can be amazing advocates in that regard. If those of you who are here with us didn't get to hear from Rise Up, which is an organization that does exactly that, positioning girls to be advocates for themselves. I've done pretty incredible advocacy here in Washington and at the UN with girl advocates who are learning about their rights and forming girls' clubs, and not to say that we need to put it all on girls themselves to fix systemic issues when the cards are stacked against them, as we've heard in so many different and intersecting strands of marginalization. But the power of an educated, mobilized, and slightly pissed off girl is not to be underestimated at the policy level or at the community level. We're also hearing the importance of both private sector as well as, and by private I'm including civil society here, as well as some of our policy and government interventions. I'd like to leave you with closing words, actually from Smitty, from one of her articles, which I think is something that I'm going to be noodling on for a while, and I'd like us to maybe noodle on together over lunch, which is how can we work to ensure that the accident of birth doesn't dictate the course of a person's life. And I think that's an excellent framing to take us into lunchtime and to think about how was our own birth accidental and how have we benefited from that, and what are we doing to understand the accidents that are continuing to impede progress for girls around the world. So thank you all for sharing your exciting research, your compelling stories, and your time with us. I hope that you've also enjoyed being here and hearing from some of the other folks in the room as much as we've heard from you and enjoyed that. We're going to be moving into the lunch segment now, and I'm told that we will have little conversation cards that we can pick up to sort of start the conversation. Reminder that the speakers are going to be anchored at different tables and available to you, but let us get lunch first, please. Thank you very much for everyone for being here. I'm sorry to those that didn't get to ask their questions. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Rudy.